Hello and welcome to another pre-season from the Rookery End. They start our 15th season and we're sort of slowly getting ourselves back into the swing of things for the start of the new season. We had the draft last week. This week we're going to look back at the 1990s, and next week we're going to have a bit of a, let's say, conflab about everything and the state of the union, the state of Watford Football Club at the moment. And we thought we'd slowly get into the heavy stuff. But this week we're going to look back at the 1990s. Oh, what a decade. Britpop, Blur versus Oasis, New Labour, Lads Mags, all those things that sum up the 1990s, but most of them at least seen as a positive thing. But what was Watford's 1990s like? Well, some of you might remember, but there is a new book out from our friends at the Watford Treasury. They have done several books over the last year or so, one on the 1950s and 60s with some amazing photography and some colorization that they did to really bring that time to life. There's one Bonza out, which was a book all about the 1970s, and now they've skipped the 80s and they've found themselves looking at the 1990s. The book is called The 90s, The Second Coming, and it's going to be out in time for the beginning of the season, and you're probably going to pick up very soon, hopefully this week, where you can get a book ready for your summer holidays. I've done a bit for it, and many Watford fans have contributed, but I wanted to chat to a few of the key people behind it. Firstly, Colin Payne, who we've had on the podcast before, one of the big brains behind the Treasury. He, in the 1990s, was part of the Yellow Experience fanzine. And in the last, 7, 8, 10 maybe years it's been since the Watford Treasury started, been a big part of putting out those fanzines. Well, they're more magazines, aren't they? As well as this latest series of books that they've been putting together. Nick Catley, he also is part of that team, and he spent his 90s as a teenager. Started age 14 and ended someone in their mid-20s. And also Ian Grant, which many of you remember. He created BeSad.org, one of the original Watford, the original Watford online resource. He was 20 at the start of the 1990s. And I want to find out more about what they remember about being a Watford fan, particularly more about this book. But we started by remembering how badly it has started. It started badly, and it sort of continued badly for a while. Why write a book about Watford in the 1990s? Or how did you approach it going, brilliant, this is the one I've been looking forward to out of all the decades you were going to write about? Nick?
I think for me, it feels like that was my decade. I think partly because you start at 14, you go through to 24. That feels like a decade with a lot of change. At the start of it, I was in secondary school and not even taking my GCSEs yet. At the end of it, I was, in a full-time job. That was the time when I started being a supporter in the sense of previously I'd been taken, I'd gone with my family and so on, but gradually moved away from the area. But that was the decade that I started going a lot more regularly, particularly when I was able to go under my own steam. That felt like when it switched from something that I did that I enjoyed doing to something that became incredibly important to me. Certainly for me, the 1990s it was the decade where that happened, and it's the decade where I suppose I felt everything the most intensely. Probably it was, we had a lot of good players, we had a lot of bad players, but probably that was to do with my age at the time.
Because Colin, you being a little bit older, and we've spoken about many parts of the Hornets' history over the years. In theory, your formative year, let's call it your formative decade, for Nick, yours was the 80s. So that was the best, as everyone sort of, the golden decade. For you, though, what did the 90s mean for you? What was your fandom like in the 1990s?
My fandom very much, it dipped in and out a little bit, to be honest, John. The early 90s, I was really committed. I was doing the Yellow Experience fanzine, standing out on the streets in the rain, trying to persuade 7,000 people to spend their money on it, going home and away. And then suddenly, very early in the 90s, I met the lady who I eventually married. By 1995, I'd had twins. And it was a season I started to dip out. But I don't think it's like now. There isn't that pressure to go every week. It's not the events they used that it is now, whereas football's this event, you're almost scared to miss it. It was almost acceptable to dip in and out. At the time, where you sat depended not on how many years you'd been going and could grab the seat, but how early you were willing to turn up at the game. If you wanted the best seat, you got there as the gate opened and you had the best seat behind the goal. Very different. For me, the 90s, I don't know, I wasn't as passionate as I was in the past. And then this thing happened halfway through it where a certain man returned and it all changed. And I think that's the wonderful thing about that decade is that change. Just the mood around the club lifted. I remember going to a game, I think it's in February when we played Ipswich and GT returned. And it was like, yeah, it's back again. It's back on again. This is that Watford that I know and love. And I think that's it. But it was ups and downs in the season, whereas I went from being extremely passionate to be honest, not even listening to the games on the radio.
What about you, Ian? How did your at university, I suppose, in 1990?
Yeah, I was at university in Brighton, and I wasn't really going to games at all at that point. I was much too busy getting drunk and going to gigs and, being a student. And there was just a point in it. I think it was like the Perriman relegation, near relegation season, where it just started to gnaw away at me somehow for some reason. I don't know whether I was a bit bored or a bit skint or something. There was something about it that just started gnawing away. And I discovered that I could get sort of score updates from Capital Gold if I sort of waggled my aerial, so to speak, as much as I could. Then I could get this sort of staticky updates from Simon Michelson on Capital Gold, which was like, I mean, it doesn't seem possible now, but that was a way of discovering what was going on in the game. It was obviously easy now, but then was absolutely impossible. It's like you could have been living on the moon for all the,
that and CFAX.
That and CFAX, yeah, exactly, yeah.
Yeah.
So that sort of tickled my interest, and so I remember sort of suddenly just discovering that the bug was still there. It gnawed away, and I had some years of unemployment, and so I couldn't do anything much. And then when I got my first job, literally one of the first things I did was buy my first season ticket, and that was the 93-94 season. I do think objectively, I do think the 90s has the perfect narrative arc, so to speak, in that if you were making a film of something, you would start off with the sort of slow decline, and then you'd have the real dip in the middle where it really does go badly wrong, and then you kind of get this surge back up, and you finish, and it sort of fits perfectly. Whereas the first sort of GT era doesn't fit in a decade neatly in the same way as the 90s is just, it's perfect.
Yeah.
And it sort of ends at Wembley, and then you can kind of shunt most of the rest of the stuff off into the noughties and just go, we don't want to know
bad
about
sequel,
that. Yeah. Exactly, yeah. Just forget about that bit. It ends at Wembley in this kind of glory. Yeah, and that's the end of the decade. So it just kind of fits absolutely beautifully.
Colin, you mentioned the fanzine. When did you start Be Sad?
Sort of beginning of 96. This is where I need Matt with me, because Matt has all of the information. He knows more about what I did with my life than I do. So.
Because it was different, wasn't it, being a fan? There was lots more, like I say, it was still very hard, as Ian sort of said, but there were these new ways, and fanzines weren't new, but it was slightly easier to follow. Ian, with starting, I started doing From the Ricker End in 2010. Which wasn't a particularly an amazing time to do it, and it did not quite peak by the end of the year, end of the decade. Did you find that changed your fandom at all?
I suppose it did. In that before that, I was going to games on my own, and you get to know the same old faces and all of that sort of thing, and you get to say hello to a few people. But it's sort of effectively going to games on my own. And I've never minded that. I love going to football, so I don't really care whether I do it on my own or not. But it definitely made it much more of a communal activity actually at the game, because suddenly there were people that you knew, people that you were introduced to, all of that sort of thing. You become a kind of bit more of part of a group rather than just somebody who goes to the football. Because if you're going from Brighton, which I was for the whole of the 90s, then you're kind of, unless you meet people on the train, which I did once or twice, I've got a couple of good friends from meeting on the train, then you're just someone who's appeared in town from nowhere, and then you've gone again, you know. So unless you know people, then it's very easy for it to become just a sort of in and out kind of thing. But yeah, it became much more sociable at that point. And obviously it changed my commitment to it, because I was basically thinking about Watford when I should be doing loads of other things every day.
BSAD actually changed a lot of people's experience of football, just because it became so much easier, particularly for fans who perhaps were slightly more distant, to connect to it, to connect together, and just to find each other and to meet up, really. And it just meant, certainly for, again, fans who were a little bit further away, that you could find suddenly you could find match reports online. Previously, you know, you hear quite a lot of people talking about having the Watford Observer sports pages sent to them, and that was basically their only contact. And now suddenly you had these reports sort of like the day after, and that made a really big difference to everything, and, you know, being able to connect with people. So I do think that's another reason that the 90s, you know, the 90s saw a big change on the field, but actually off the field it saw this big change, because at the end of it, the internet was pretty much everyone used it, more or less, and at the start it was unheard of, and I think that was a very big change.
Colin, you said you started doing fanzines. Did you feel a similar thing, you know, that sort of connection to the club, even though it was at that point, say, in decline? Did you find that the fanzine helped?
It did, but it was funny. Being pre-internet, it wasn't like now where me and Nick had done YBR, and you sort of email 30 people and say, if you'd like to do something, just send it, please send it in, you know, anything you want. Back in them days, you was reliant on getting sort of pieces of handwritten paper through the post for these articles, and you'd get them, and you'd get anything over a few pages. You think, oh, now I've got to type all this up. Yeah, there wasn't that. And it was literally, it was very primitive. So you didn't have that community. There was only a couple of people that actually wrote for it. There were a lot of pseudonyms in there where I was writing under different names to make it look like it was some sort of publishing behemoth. But at the end of the day, there was only me. I think Mark Evans and Mark Harrowell were my contributors, really, and that was it. But what there was the club that, for all its faults in the 90s and people talking about how it's badly run and what have you, they were always open. Every request I sent in for an interview, be that whether manager or player, was granted. They were really helpful. They allowed us to sort of sell outside the ground when we had a bit of trouble with the council. They tried to chase us off for once for street trade selling. The club said, oh, you can use Occupation Road, it's private. And it was, the club was very helpful, but as a community, it was very much sort of a one or two people band, the fanzine, although it used to sell well. So they all did. There was 5 at the time, 5 fanzines, and I think all of them sold quite well.
Nick, for you, though, what was your relationship? You know, we've got the current, whatever it is at the moment, relationship with the club and whatever the owner is. And unfortunately, he's died recently, but Jack Petchey, often seen as this character who had to be the one after Elton. And that wasn't a great relationship at all. How did you feel about him? I know it's different now, but at the time, how do you remember thinking about the ownership and the managers, I suppose?
In terms of Jack Petchey, I think it's difficult to remember just sort of how little information you had, really. And to some extent, what you really knew at that time was that the club used to be good. And as you say, Jack Petchey was the one who came after Elton. He was never going to be particularly liked. And I suppose I went down that route to a large extent. There's Colin's done a piece in the book about actually Jack Petchey wasn't too bad, and this is a view that Colin holds in the face of probably the opinion of most Watford supporters. But he makes a very good argument. But either way, he was never going to be liked. I think certainly of the managers of the 90s, the one that I particularly liked, I suppose, obviously the start of the 90s, was Glenn Roeder. I thought that he did a lot. He was very honest. He got if you look at that team from 1994-95, and that was in a way that was my formative season. That was the first time I went to more or less every game. I think I didn't miss one after November. But if you look at the players in that team, the likes of Miller, Foster, Hessenthaler, Ramage, Phillips, Porter, there's a lot of players who are really, you would think of as if not quite Watford all-time greats, then right up there. I did like Glenn Roeder a lot. In the book, Dave Messenger talks about the search for a striker, and I think that was one of the things that brought him down in the end. Certainly in terms of the ownership, you had the narrative, as Ian mentioned earlier, but the strange thing that was going on was that the worst period was almost just after we knew that things were going to get better, because we went down in 1996 and we knew that Graham Taylor was already back and we're going to be in the background. And I think it's easy to say with hindsight, but I think there was a little bit of, Graham's back, we're going to be all right one way or another. I think there was a little bit of that, although obviously we didn't quite know how that would work out. But I do remember a particularly strange game at the end of the 96-97 season. It was the most awful 0-0 draw against Bury you can imagine. And I think we missed a penalty. And what was particularly strange, I believe Bury, with that point, won the title. So their fans were all celebrating, and we were all celebrating as well, because it had just been announced before the game that Elton John was coming back as the chairman. So it was this really strange atmosphere where we were all really happy for them, really happy for ourselves. I don't think we quite realised at that point that Graham Taylor was going to be coming back, but I think people had a reasonable idea, as in coming back as manager. And then obviously from then on, things got a lot better. But yes, I think I tend to go along with Colin that perhaps Jack Petchey was a bit more maligned than he deserved to be. But certainly about 20 years later, when I was in a teaching training session somewhere, and they talked about all the facilities that this benefactor Jack Petchey had provided, I thought, really? I was just absolutely amazed to find out about all the things he'd done. So, I mean, it wasn't, looking back, it wasn't a life badly lived. And I suppose you can't argue too much with someone who wants a football team to be a self-sustaining entity. But it was much more fun with Elton.
So go on, Colin. Your last book about the 1970s, the title was about getting out the owner. Bonza, get him out. Bonza out. And it's, some people might have said that maybe Petchey out could have been easily the sequel to it. But not for you, though.
No. Firstly, Jack Petchey, I'm going to go back to him. He was someone, you look at the club after he left, he was, apart from Elton John, all our owners have been almost these local businessmen that have put in some money, but nothing like that. And Jack Petchey was true to that form. But what he did do at a time when gates nationally were dropping, it wasn't just Watford, but nationally, the gates were dropping, clubs were, and rightly so, to improve the stadiums and that. We ended up sort of staying solvent. We managed to trade. We managed to avoid relegation until that season when GT come back. We got 2.5 new stands out of it. And I maintain, and it is an unpopular thing, I remember writing an article and it was put in the Watford Observer, and the comments underneath were true to form. It was like you'd think I declared sort of, I don't know, Vladimir Putin was doing a really good job.
Never look below the line.
Yeah, below the line. That's atrocious. But at the end of the day, I maintain the Potsos wouldn't have bought Watford if it wasn't for the position that Petchey had left the club in, really, went out and took over. We'd done well. And the football, we suffered a little bit. But the club stayed afloat, and they were very difficult times.
Ian, there were lots of changes, not just at Watford, but in football. We talked about, that internet starting, but also, it was 92 with the Sky deal and the Premier League starting and everything with the stadiums. Did you feel that impact in the 90s, or was it just nice? Because I wrote a bit for the book, and it was all about the picture of Harry Hornet, and behind him is the Vicarage Road end being destroyed. That sort of contrast of the beginning of this razzmatazz that Harry Hornet brings to Watford, and the Premier League brought to Sky, but also this ever changing. The place you went to changed a lot. Did you feel that change was right? Did you enjoy it? Did it feel good?
Did it feel good? I don't think it felt good. It felt like it didn't feel. I don't think it felt bad or good. It felt like a sort of period of quite intense transition. Certainly at the ground it was. We played a significant part of a season with advertising hoardings at one end of the pitch. That sort of thing feels very transitional. And there was obviously a great degree of upheaval in the top flight, but we felt fairly far removed from that by that point. It was a strange sort of time, and our attendances were declining steadily, so that single four digit attendances were, increasingly common. It's that thing where following a football team, going to games really regularly, all of that sort of thing, it sort of stops mattering how the team's doing in a way, because it's such a sort of commitment of your life and what is sort of a choice. That's what I'm going to do. That in a sense, well, you get a buzz from a win and a sort of from a loss. You're still going to go next week. There's still going to be a game next week. And so it feels like a sort of constant. It's one of the joys of football. It feels like a kind of constant process. Yeah, the 1997 definitely felt like a process some of the time and a bit of a chore some of the time. But it was always a joy. You can still, I always say, at any level of football, you can see a great game or you can see a terrible game. You can go to the best, you can see the best Premier League players. It could still be a terrible game. You can go to a park and see a game and it could be a 5-4 thriller. It's not necessarily about the quality of the football as much as the experience and the excitement of a particular game, or, being a fan of particular players, seeing young players come through, seeing, that all of that sort of thing.
On that note, it was very noticeable that we expected to have an awful lot, when we asked for contributions, we expected to have an awful lot about the last few years and not very much about the early years, and to sort of have to beg and borrow a few articles about that. But actually, people were just as keen to write about the early 90s and those years as they were the later years. And I think partly, perhaps the later years have been more covered than the earlier years in the past. But I think also that it comes back to this thing that the football, more or less as Ian was saying, going to the football is not really about the football, or at least only partially about the football. It's all about that experience. To some extent, being there sort of all through the early 90s was a bit of a badge of honour. I went to Barnsley and it was rubbish, kind of thing. That is something that comes through, that people's enjoyment is it's only partially dependent on what's going on the pitch. And certainly I can remember the latter half of that 97-98 championship season. I just remember being an absolute nervous wreck, because you may well remember the first half of that season, we were absolutely brilliant. I think Wrexham got a last-minute equaliser that meant we didn't get 50 points from our first 20 games or something like that. And then the end of the season, we were really in mid-table form. And you just felt, we can't throw this away now, surely. And it was not that pleasant an experience. The last day at Fulham was absolutely fantastic, but you just always felt you had something to lose. Whereas sometimes there's something about being mid-table and having nothing to lose and then winning a game that you shouldn't that actually is really enjoyable.
And there's a sense, I think, if you're going and there's 9,000 in the ground and it's raining and it's February or something, there is a sense that you've invested more in being there than if there's 20,000 in the ground, it's a sunny August Saturday. It doesn't make you a better supporter or anything, but it does mean that if you score a last minute winner or something, you're right up for it, because you've really made an effort to be there and everybody else has done likewise. So it's a sort of different dynamic. It's that thing where if you get a big cup game and the ground's sold out, quite often the atmosphere is more flat than if you've got the hardcore in. You said
badge of honour there, Nick, and Ian, you sort of talked about it in terms of I'm a better fan than you, and I feel, having lived through the 1990s in my teenage years, I don't feel I'm a better. And this is where on current social media, where it feels like I'm trying to be. If you speak to, I've stopped doing it, because it's not trying to say because I've been through that I'm a better fan, or it's just me trying to say, look, when you get all hoity-toity about, being in the Premier League, it's going, yeah, but I just appreciate it differently because of what I went through. That sort of period I went through where I started going 86, the last year of GT, then it started falling apart, and then it was terrible. I never had a massive high in a very early part of my, Watford fandom. There's people, I suppose in some ways, Colin, we could look at you, but a little bit earlier. The fact that, the fact that you started, let's say, and saw positivity and greatness in your fandom, then it went down. You made it through to the other side, and we've had some ups and downs and ups since. Do you feel, though, the 90s, in terms of your mentality, let's say, about approaching, football, was the 90s important, as important it is to me, let's say, in terms of coping mechanisms or the fact that you've made it through a bad patch?
For me, and I'm going back to the 70s again, I started going in 1977, so I literally jumped on the bandwagon as it was started speeding up. I didn't see any bad days, really, not properly, until the end of the 80s, beginning of the 90s. But what I did then, I had this grudging admiration for these sort of sour-faced people you saw with their mustard yellow and black scarves with the old badges and patches, and you think, yeah, you were there. You were at Halifax and Hartlepool and Doncaster and what have you. And I thought, I wish I could have done that. And then sort of you have to be careful what you wish for, because come the 90s, yeah, it did. And it's like Ian said, I remember going to away games and literally sort of, you're lucky if there's 100 Watford fans there, particularly night games in the Midlands and up north. Watford didn't have this massive away following. Like, you'd go there and now everyone goes away and it's like this event, everyone's singing and on their feet for 90 minutes. Back then, people were sitting on the terraces sort of in silence, sort of just hoping that you win so that journey home would be a bit better. A case of your 90s are your Jews, really, aren't they? They're your sort of, it allows you that ticket to the good times, so you're not like a Manchester United fan or a Liverpool fan. You can turn around and say, yeah, but we were there when it was crap.
It does mean that when you get that high at the end of it, which obviously we did, if you've been through all of the lows, then that high is so much higher. And that's not to denigrate anybody else's experience, but it's sort of, that high at Wembley is so much higher if you've seen all of the stuff along the way. It's like, if you've caught the last 10 minutes of the movie, you haven't really seen the movie, have you? But if you've seen the whole movie and then you get to that happy ending, it's really something.
We're all slightly different ages, but the 90s provided perspective, because in a sense, the people born, say, in the mid-70s, as I was, we had caught the last 10 minutes of the first Graham Taylor movie, if you will. I went to my first game in 1980, so that was quite reasonably early on, but I was 4. I didn't really understand what I was watching. And then I was 12 when Graham Taylor left the first time. And although I was at the cup final as an 8-year-old, I knew that was a big deal, but I didn't know quite how big a deal that was. And I knew that it was a big deal for Watford to be in the first division, but I didn't really know quite how big a deal. And so by the time a bit of success came around again, I understood what it meant a lot better. And I think for my generation of people, that's perhaps why the 90s felt so important.
We talk about the Roy the Rovers ending to it all. That part, just after halfway through where Graham did return, Ian, did you really truly believe, or did you just dream that it was going to come again?
I didn't believe in it at all, if I'm honest. No. I mean, it's not to say I didn't welcome it. I was obviously happy to have him back and everything, but I didn't see any of that coming. I remember I did a preview for some magazine or other. I did a sort of questionnaire preview thing of the 97-98 season, and I pretty just finished 7th and said, Rome wasn't built in a day, sort of thing.
Okay.
So no, I didn't see it coming. And Graham Taylor's stock was low at the time. Obviously, it was high with us, but it was low, and the money had been extremely tight the previous season. It had all been pretty grim. So no, I didn't see what was going to happen, which made it all the better. Expectations weren't massively high, really. Obviously, hopes were high, but I don't think expectations were high. And expectations are such a mood killer at football.
God, yeah. So I'm going to ask you, it might be a tough question. I don't want you to tell me the best season in the 1990s. I want you to tell me your favourite season of the 1990s, or maybe you might sort of merge it a little bit in terms of your favourite manager or your favourite team that you had. But when was your favourite, Nick?
I've mentioned it already, but it was 1994-95. I think for a number of reasons. It was the season that I first started going every week. I didn't miss a game after November. I think I missed about 8 games. Went from November 94 to September 95, going to every game, eventually broken by Northants getting to the NatWest final, a day that was ruined by Dickie Bird, but that's another story which we'll leave for now. And again, it was partly because it was so unexpected. We were very much relegation favourites because we'd escaped from relegation the season before, and the hints of it were there at the end in the running for that season, but quite often you get a decent run and it doesn't sustain. But actually, the incredible defensive improvement, that if you look at it, it was almost all when Colin Foster was in the team, and sometimes he was injured and it didn't work out. And then we brought in Kevin Miller, who made a big difference at the back, and suddenly it all started to gel. And we still only finished 7th. It wasn't a fantastic season, but it was a season where things seemed to work out. And the other thing I really loved about that season was, one of the things I've always loved about football, I think most people do, is that goals are so important. So I don't like basketball. I like most sports, but I can't do basketball because when am I supposed to get excited? There are too many points. Whereas in football, goals are quite rare. And that season, they were incredibly rare. But that almost became a good thing because when we scored, it was incredibly important. And I think, apart from the first few games of the season, I think Kevin Miller was suspended for a few games. When we scored at home, or when we opened the scoring at home, we won. We only lost 3 times at home all season. We weren't that great away, but we were very solid. And for a long time, we hadn't been solid. And then there was also quite a lot of players that are among my all-time heroes, really. Kevin Miller, certainly at that time, was one of them. The big one, who I didn't mention earlier, shamefully, was Tommy Mooney, who I absolutely loved. And that was one of his big seasons. It was, of course, the season where Craig Ramage was absolutely superb, where he was the player who, if he'd been like that all the time, wouldn't have been anywhere near us. It was one of Hessenthaler's peak seasons. He was absolutely fantastic. It was a season where Kevin Phillips emerged, Colin Foster being so solid at the back, and I just absolutely loved it. I was going to all the games, and just about most of the ground still had terraces, which I absolutely loved. And so that was my favourite season for all those reasons. But then the next season, obviously that wasn't a good one, but that was the season where Graham Taylor came back. And so that sustained the interest for a little bit longer. I honestly can't remember whether I expected Graham Taylor to be successful, but I remember being excited about it. And then there was enough in the games to be excited. I think by the end of 96-97, and Ian writes an excellent piece about 96-97 in the book, most people were not very excited, I think it's fair to say, by the end of 96-97. But then at the end of that season, you had the fillip of Elton John coming back and Graham Taylor coming back as manager, which then saw us through for the rest of the decade.
Colin, a favourite year for you?
Oh, I'm going to go obvious. It's 98-99 was my favourite year. Just for the last couple of months, but even if just on Wembley alone, I would take it. I would take that as my all-time favourite moment watching Watford, and probably my favourite season. The season that was most fun, though, and I can only have half of it, I think was the Premiership season, when 99 to 2000, I'm going to squeeze in for fun. For me personally, and it was down a lot to the internet, the people I met, the people I got to know, the places we went to, and just that camaraderie amongst Watford support was something special that season. And that's my most fun, but my favourite season is 98-99.
What about you, Ian?
Well, I'll wave a flag for 93-94, just because it was my first season back, and it was a pretty wild season in terms of looking like we were going to get relegated, and then sort of clawing our way out of it. It had the Peterborough away, which was the worst game that's ever been played, I think. It's truly awful, but just brilliant. Amazing atmosphere. You can still picture that terrace. It's just extraordinary, the atmosphere. But, I mean, you can't beat 98-99. It cannot be beaten, I don't think. That ride at the end was unbelievable. It just sort of consumed every moment when you were awake and a few when you were asleep as well. It was extraordinary, just that run to the playoff final, and then to cap it off by winning at Wembley. I don't think I ever have, and I don't think I ever will have a better 10 seconds in my life than after Alan Smart scored. It was extraordinary. It was like every single emotion pouring out of you. I remember crying and screaming at the same time. It was unbelievable. And obviously the beauty of football is that you don't know it's coming until it happens. So, people have sort of said, well, but what about the day you got married? And it's like, well, I knew I was going to get married, though. I knew that was going to happen. It wasn't,
Surprise!
I trusted that was going to happen. Whereas, a football match, you don't know until it happens. And now, obviously now you've got VAR, so it can unhappen. but at that moment, it just released everything. Yeah, that was unbelievable that time. And to get to write about it kind of after each game, so you're kind of digesting it and then trying to capture it for people, just fantastic. Just something else.
That run was absolutely incredible. I am interested to know how much of how much we enjoyed that time was the vindication of Graham Taylor, because obviously winning a playoff final, we absolutely love it. Of course we do. We love the success, but certainly I felt a big part of that was just how important it was that Graham Taylor had been rehabilitated in the national media and so on and so forth. And to an extent, I contest that, because 7 years later, we won promotion in the playoff final again. And, it was great. It was unexpected. It wasn't quite the run at the end of the season. It was arguably a team that had a better season than they did in 99. But I don't remember it anywhere near as fondly. I'm interested to know if other people think the same thing, but that's certainly partly how I felt about it.
I think that's definitely true. We'd been further into the wilderness before that, and obviously the first time you do anything is sort of often the best time. It certainly has a sort of a novelty about it. Well, not novelty is the wrong word. And yeah, definitely sort of seeing Graham Taylor win at Wembley, that was a big symbolic thing. And obviously he's woven into the fabric of the club, that you're kind of seeing your club win at Wembley, seeing Graham Taylor win at Wembley. It just felt like a massive vindication of everything that we were and what the club stood for. Sort of wiped away some of 1984. Definitely, it felt like that. It was everything, really, wasn't it?
This is going to be a nice little summer read, I think, for people as they go off and for Watford fans, they go off on holiday. Where can I get hold of it? What else is in it? What have we not talked about that you think you should point out, Colin?
Where you can get it, first of all, you can get it from our website, which is the watfordtreasury.com, nice and simple, or the Hornet Shop will be stocking it. They'll have it in time for the Brentford pre-season friendly and onwards. It's priced £18 and 264 pages. I think that's quite good value, if I say so myself. What's in it? I'm going to hand you over to Nick.
In terms of what's in it, I think maybe my favourite part of the book is a description by Mark Harrowell. So Mark's written a piece about the 97-98 season, but he writes a fantastic description of one of my favourite goals by just about my favourite player, which was Tommy Mooney. We'd gone 2-0 up against Bristol Rovers. They had pegged us back to 2-2, which at that stage of that season seemed to be happening quite a lot. And he just ploughed through. In my mind now, there were around 5 Bristol Rovers defenders hanging on his back while he managed to get through and hit the ball and hit it in from a narrow angle. It's one of just about my favourite goal of his, although you can find various of his. I think, Ian, did you describe his goal at Port Vale as a torrent of a goal or something along those lines?
Probably something like that. There were certain goals that Tommy Mooney scored that only Tommy Mooney could ever score.
Oh, it was incredible. And this was almost the right marker among them. Mark describes him as a Terminator T-1000 ploughing through the defence. And so that is something that it sticks in my mind incredibly well. And he makes the really good point. He says, I've not been as nearly as disciplined as this. He says he's never sought out that goal on YouTube because he doesn't want to take away from the image he's got of it in his mind. And I sometimes think that about various goals, particularly the Troy Deeney goal. Now, I couldn't have not watched that again, but I fear that now, or the way I remember it is how it looked like on TV, and I try and remember what it looked like from the back of the rookery, and sometimes I can remember and sometimes I can't. But obviously there's no way I could have not watched that goal again, but I thought it was a really interesting point.
Ian, what have you written in the book?
I've written more than I thought I'd written. In that my playoff final report is reproduced in full. I've also written a piece about the 96-97 season, which was the lowest point of the decade. It was absolutely miserable, and I do kind of like writing about really miserable things. You can really get your teeth into it all. and also a piece about the local derbies across the decade, which I think were quite an interesting barometer of where we were and also where them up the road were as well. And they were really squalid games, quite a lot of those. So again, that's quite good to get your teeth into.
There's a picture in that article about the rivalry games, which I absolutely love. And it was during that season where there were just boards up behind the Rookery goal. And it was just, Watford and Luton players at each other's throats a little bit. But the great thing is you look at it and there's just a fence. So it looks like they're just playing on a park pitch. And it kind of sums up how those games were. It was unimportant to everyone else except us, to whom it was incredibly important. And often, the worse you do, the more important local derbies become because you have nothing else. And I think Ian's piece just sums up those derbies absolutely fantastically.
You've lived it, I suppose, back in the book a little bit. Would you like to live it, let's say, for the next decade of being a Watford fan between now and 2030 and everything that's happened in the last few years? If that was a very similar, would that be okay with you?
I think it would with me. I hate to be an old person about it, but I'm going to be anyway. I think football now is almost immeasurably better, I suspect. I suspect teams now would generally beat teams from 20 years ago very, very easily. But sometimes, and it probably is my age, sometimes it feels a little bit less exciting. It's almost like less is happening. I think the precision of it is incredible. And I think it is done in a way to create better chances, a higher percentage chance of scoring. But sometimes there's long periods of games where it feels like not much is going on. I think you need to enjoy modern football to an extent, you have to be perhaps more tactically literate than I am. That's the way the game's gone. I think people have grown up with it. I'm not saying it's a bad thing because, as I say, I suspect it has made sides better. But it does feel sometimes like more was going on that you could perhaps get into during that decade.
Is there anything you'd like to bring back, Colin?
Oh, yeah, smaller crowds. Certainly. Being able to sit wherever you
Shorter
like.
toilet queues, it was great.
I really sort of quite like the 90s. You speak of the change and that. For me, the all-seater stadiums, when I was doing the fanzine, I sort of railed against them, and it even went on a little demonstration in London to sort of protest against them. When they actually come in, I thought, yeah, this is the way forward. This is what I want. Sort of the atmosphere become better because we were sitting under a roof at the Vicarage Road end. You could sit pretty much where you wanted in the stand. To a certain degree, you didn't have that competitiveness where you've got the rivalry sort of died a bit amongst the supporters. I think the hooligans went off to sort of rave and take MDMA, and the crowds dropped. You didn't have great away supports. It was quite nice to go and watch a football game without sort of being abused by the opposition fans and what have you. And yeah, I'd go back to the 90s. I quite enjoyed it.
And Ian, if you could bring one player back, who would you like to bring back? And if I really want to push you and challenge you, then I want to say they weren't allowed to be part of the 99 playoff. Win.
You swine. When I think about that, I will say that one thing I would change probably, and obviously it wouldn't be popular, is that I probably, when I got to building a website and launching a website in 1995, which is actually when I did it, I think, I'd do it about something that wasn't a small regional football team, and I'd invent something that would mean that I would be a billionaire by now. Because I did, in a tiny little way, I suppose I was some sort of pioneer, but I managed to not make myself rich in the process. And I think that's a shame. And I'd go back and change that. Dennis Bailey. Let's have Dennis Bailey back up front.
Okay. He was definitely a striker. I was going to say Kevin Phillips, but yeah, I'll take Dennis Bailey.
Yeah, well, fair enough.
I'd have Paul Furlong back.
That's fair enough.
Yeah.
It's Hessenthaler for me.
He's still playing somewhere, probably, isn't he?
He almost certainly is, isn't he? Yeah.
Still running around.
From the Rookery End, a podcast about life following Watford FC.
A mega huge thank you to Colin, Nick and Ian for their time and sharing their memories of the 1990s. And thank you for listening and for your continued listening to From the Rookery. Do follow us on all the socials at Watford Podcast. And we're back again next week with I'm not going to say serious, but we're going to have a good old chat about where Watford is and what our expectations really should be this season and in the next few years. So we're back with another pre-season podcast next week. Come on, you boys!